Jujutsu Kaisen's manga began serialization in March of 2018. It itself is a sequel to Tokyo Metropolitan Curse Technical School, which ran for 4 months in 2017, later renamed to Jujutsu Kaisen 0 in December of 2018. The anime began airing in October of 2020 and finished in March of 2021. It follows a character named Itadori Yuji who swallowed one of the 20 fingers of a supremely powerful and evil being named Ryomen Sukuna, turning Yuji into a vessel for him. The story is about finding and feeding the remaining fingers to Yuji in the hopes of eventually defeating Sukuna. The only reason why I'm listing all of this off is because I had never heard of Jujutsu Kaisen before the anime began airing. Therefore, going into it, I didn't really know exactly what to expect. I didn't go into it completely blind as I knew what a handful of characters already looked like just by the virtue of being on the internet. Outside of that, the only thing I was aware of was the enormous hype that had been building itself into a frenzy. We'll get to that hype later because I think it's a relevant topic when discussing my overall thoughts on Jujutsu Kaisen. To give a vague and spoiler-free summary of my thoughts on Jujutsu Kaisen, I liked a lot of what it had to offer. I had a few minor problems and some standout moments here and there, but the overall quality of it holds consistently strong for the most part. I know that just sounds like me running a whole lot of circles around my overall thoughts instead of actually talking about them, so we'll do the spoiler warning as usual and then get started. This video will contain spoilers for only Season 1 of Jujutsu Kaisen. There will be no manga spoilers for both the series and its prequel. I've divided this video into 3 major sections in the hopes of keeping it mostly organized. The first section will address the curse system of Jujutsu Kaisen. The second will be my general thoughts on each of the arcs, and the third will be a brief look at just a couple of the characters, and when I say just a couple, it really is just a couple. For anyone that may be wondering why there's no dedicated section to the action, it's just because I don't have a whole lot to say about it outside of the fact that it looks amazing. I have very minimal knowledge when it comes to animation, so it's not a topic I feel particularly comfortable discussing outside of very basic opinions. The action will be brought up here and there, though, when appropriate. If you were to strip away everything else in Jujutsu Kaisen and isolate the curse system as it is, it would still deserve a whole lot of praise. The curse system is easily one of the most detailed and fleshed out power systems I've seen in 4 ways by showing an impressive diversity in its pool of powers, the range of complexity in the powers themselves, the variety in the way these curses present themselves, and the ways in which the system as a whole affects the world around it. For those familiar with Jujutsu Kaisen, this is going to be a lot of me describing what happens, but I think it's worth really hammering home just how impressive the curse system is. To begin with, cursed energy as a whole is generated through negative emotions of human beings. It's a very simple start to a concept that leaves a lot of room for exploration and experimentation, which Jujutsu Kaisen very gladly takes advantage of. The simplest display of this would be amplifying your own hits with cursed energy. This is the primary way in which Yuji wields cursed energy because at the start of the anime he is quite the amateur at it. This alone has some diversity in it, the 2 main ones being Divergent Fist and Black Flash. Divergent Fist is Yuji's signature technique, if you want to call it that, where the impact of the cursed energy lags behind the impact of the actual physical hit, resulting in a double strike. Black Flash is basically the same thing but at an extreme scale, with the cursed energy only lagging behind by 1/trillionth of a second, leading to amplifying the hit's overall power by 2.5 times the original impact. A successful Black Flash causes its user to enter the zone where their control of cursed energy becomes as natural as breathing, supposedly. To further expand upon the concept of empowering raw hits, this can be made a little more complicated through something like Nanami Kento's ratio technique, where Nanami can visualize a 7:3 ratio on the enemy's body to create a weak point and strike that point for massive damage. And since you can empower your hits with cursed energy, you can also block hits by reinforcing your body with cursed energy, which isn't visually displayed, but it's brought up enough times that it never came up as a surprise when it happened. To flip the switch, we have one of the most advanced techniques, Gojo's Power of Infinity. It's a power that, within the context of Jujutsu Kaisen, I don't really get, but I'm okay with that. Given that Gojo is pretty distinctly the strongest character in the anime, at least of what's been animated so far, I don't mind that the concept of infinity goes over my head a bit because it kind of adds to that sense of awe surrounding that character whenever he's fighting. Anyways, Gojo's techniques are easily some of the strongest displays of Jujutsu sorcery and is a far cry from the more humble beginnings like Divergent Fist. This includes things such as casually floating in the air, blasting enemies through entire forests, and then destroying forests with giant energy balls. There's also his Unlimited Void, which overloads the target with so much information that it effectively paralyzes them, but we'll get to the topic of domains in a little bit. Let's bounce back to something that is much more simple. Even though I hate the name, Boogie Woogie is easily one of the most simple yet interesting techniques in Jujutsu Kaisen and one of the best examples to showcase the diversity a single technique can provide. In essence, Boogie Woogie allows Todo Ai to swap locations between 2 beings possessing just enough cursed energy with a single clap activating it. At first, Todo swaps between himself and an enemy named Hanami. Then he swaps between himself and Yuji. and then he swaps between Yuji and Hanami, and then he swaps Yuji in a weapon containing cursed energy. My favorite part of Boogie Woogie is the most simple one where Todo simply claps without actually activating it to play mind games with Hanami. It's consistent development upon a very simple technique, and while I can't say that every other technique lives up to the level of Boogie Woogie's development, just how much I enjoyed watching the technique alone is worth calling it out for me. It should also be noted that the development on Boogie Woogie leads to changes in the enemy's perception as well, with Hanami at first feeling confused and terrified due to the chaos caused by all the swapping, then eventually adapting to start throwing his hits before these swaps occur to ensure they land after the swap finishes. Overall, Boogie Woogie is easily one of, if not my favorite techniques displayed in Jujutsu Kaisen. We mentioned Hanami, so we might as well talk a bit more about the villains in more detail. Some of the main villains throughout Season 1 are these elemental special grade tier cursed spirits. We have Hanami the forest spirit, and Jogo the earth spirit. There's also technically a third ocean spirit, but he does literally nothing in this season, so there's that. I wanted to bring these guys up because they're the prime example of cursed energy being used to control the elements, and they're also some of the most visually enthralling uses of cursed energy. Jogo puts on quite a display of fireworks, and Hanami's ability to control and transmute nature is one of the most visually phenomenal abilities in the anime. I think it's also worth bringing up that Hanami has a move specifically designed to counter using cursed energy to block hits, which Todo manages to figure out in an impressive span of 1/100th of a second and swaps to block the move with raw muscle over cursed energy, which fits Todo well since his fighting style consists of mostly close combat. Continuing with the theme of villains, we have Mahito, who is the main villain in one of the arcs. Mahito's technique of idol transfiguration is definitely the most grotesque we've seen out of this anime, at least within the confines of just this season. While Mahito's philosophical speech about the body and soul is too smart and enlightened for someone like me, Mahito changing the shape of the soul to change the body is interesting in how it's presented, with Mahito doing just that to himself to transform parts of his body to all sorts of different things, or accidentally touching Sukuna and Yuji's soul and almost dying for it, or even Nanami subconsciously guarding his own soul when Mahito attempts to make contact with it. The most disturbing of all is, of course, the fact that Mahito always carries shriveled up human beings with him so he can transfigure them and use them as a sort of live ammunition in battle, and some of these disfigured humans start crying out for help, as you can see that it affects both Nanami and Yuji in battle. It's a twisted concept that stands out thanks to both the flexibility of its presentation and some of the context that it's presented in. The second year student Inumaki Toge possesses a technique known as cursed speech. It basically forces anyone that hears the user's word to follow them. For example, if you tell someone to sleep, then they fall asleep. If you say don't move, then they can't move. Repeated use eventually takes a toll on the user's body. While all of this is pretty neat, I like cursed speech because of the limitations it lays on Inumaki. Under most circumstances, because of the nature of his technique, he has to severely limit his vocabulary, which consists of rice ball ingredients of all things. According to the wiki, aside from a few select words, most of it is just gibberish, apparently. I appreciate the honesty, but yeah, it's cool to see a way to make a character distinct while providing context for what makes them distinct, aside from being quirky for the sake of just being quirky. Cursed speech acts as a decent transition to now start looking at some of the ways in which cursed energy is presented to us. The first one to start with would be one we've already touched upon, those being cursed spirits. These are the main antagonistic force of Jujutsu Kaisen and are physical manifestations of cursed energy. The ones I found the most interesting are the elemental ones because they were formed of humanity's collective fears of natural disasters. It's a rather simple way to explain where these constantly pop out of without needing some sort of extravagant explanation, and simple works well when there is so much else happening in regards to curses in the anime. Going from one physical manifestation to another, we have Shikigamis. Shikigami are curses that take the form of an animal to fight with or on behalf of the sorcerer wielding it. The two examples we see in the anime are the jellyfish Yoshino learns to summon, or the entire petting zoo's worth of these Megumi has in his shadowy back pocket. These provide another interesting layer to the combat when they are involved, especially with Megumi because he starts practicing close combat as the anime progresses to fight alongside his Shikigami rather than just commanding them. And for that close combat, he utilizes cursed tools. Cursed tools are, as the name says, tools with cursed energy. These tools are the weapons you see some sorcerers wielding when fighting cursed spirits because the energy imbued in them makes them a viable method for exorcism. Examples would be like the knife Yuji wields for a short time, Nanami's wrapped blade, Miwa's katana, Mai's gun, and Gakuganji's guitar. Some characters almost exclusively use these tools in place of fancy techniques such as Maki. I like cursed tools in particular because it actually provides a bit of context as to why sorcerers start pulling out weapons during the middle of fights instead of saying just for the hell of it. Cursed corpses aren't actually corpses, but rather inanimate objects that are brought to life through the power of curses. This can be things like little plush dolls, big plush dolls, mannequins, and robots. While most of these aren't that important and don't have any real depth to them, the few that do are really good and provide more details about the user behind those corpses. Similar to cursed tools, these also provide context as to why one episode is about a giant panda gorilla hybrid thing, making JoJo references while fighting a laser robot. Veils and domains act as interesting ways they can change the location and participants of the fight without a generous application of arbitrary bullshit. Veils are giant curse bubbles that can be dropped around an area to limit those who can enter and exit. Veils can also be specified to deny entrance to certain people at the cost of allowing more to enter, which is the case with the veil that drops near Tokyo Tech, designed to block out exclusively Gojo. Domains are the peak of Jujutsu sorcery, where a user can expend a ton of cursed energy to create a very small bubble to trap themselves and anyone nearby with them. It creates a special arena inside reflecting the creator, and any techniques the creator uses while inside the domain is guaranteed to hit. There's weaker variations of domains such as incomplete domains, which are pretty self-explanatory, and simple domains, which are mini domains used as a countermeasure like the one Miwa throws down to counter incoming attackers. The different kinds of domain expansions, notably Gojo's and Megumi's, stand as some of the most visually striking moments of Jujutsu Kaisen to me. The last thing about curses I'd like to talk about is in the ways that the system affects the world around itself. These moments not only add details to the curse system, but also bits and pieces to the larger world building of Jujutsu Kaisen as well. While Gojo did get Yuji's execution indefinitely suspended, there's the older higher-ups that want to have Yuji immediately executed. There's an interesting back and forth between the so-called conservative old guards and the progressive new guards represented by Kakuganji and Gojo respectively. There's even people that are a little bit of both like Nanami. My only complaint is that I wish we got to see where most of the adults in the series lined up on the spectrum. In places such as schools and hospitals, the large amount of negative energy generated there causes them to become a hotspot for curses. Likewise, suspicious sites near locations such as cemeteries are also likely to be crawling with curses because people associate cemeteries with fear. Schools typically keep cursed objects as talismans since strong curses supposedly ward away weaker ones, such as the finger of Sukuna Yuji found, although according to Megumi this is a bad practice that only ends up drawing in more curses. Death paintings are children born between humans and curses brought into existence due to the disturbing tale of Kamo Noritoshi. From what I can see, there's sort of a muddled gray point between curses and humans, and their appearances and maybe even their intellectual capabilities vary wildly from one another. Unlike typical curses who disappear upon a successful exorcism, the bodies of death paintings remain, which also muddles up whether or not you killed a human or exorcised a curse. According to Panda in episode 5, there's a large influx of curses in early summer as a result of negative emotions built up over winter and spring, which leads to a shortage of sorcerers during that time of the year. And even though this isn't really tied directly to the curse system or the world building, I would just like to bring up how well the anime explains its own power system to the viewer. While Yuji is not exactly stupid or anything, he's not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed either. I like that the anime takes advantage of this from time to time to provide very simplistic explanations of how some aspects of the curse system work to the viewer, such as explaining tiers of cursed spirit grades or the difference between cursed energy and cursed techniques. And for this video, that's where we'll end it for curses. Those familiar with the series will know that I haven't covered every detail related to curses, but I think I've said enough about them to substantiate the claim I made near the start, that the curse system of Jujutsu Kaisen is one of the most detailed and fleshed out power systems I've seen. Moving on to the story arcs, Season 1 of Jujutsu Kaisen has a total of 6. The introduction arc is from episode 1 to 3. The Cursed Womb arc is from 4 to the first half of 5. The Cursed Training arc is from the second half of 5 to 8. The Versus Mahito arc is from 9 to 13. The Kyoto Goodwill event arc is from 14 to 21. And lastly, the Death Painting arc is from 22 to 24. To be completely honest, I found the introduction arc to be pretty uninteresting. The fights are cool to look at, and while Gojo's little antics were pretty funny outside of Nobara's backstory, nothing else stood out for me. Although given that the reveal of episode 1 was all told by Gojo to Yuji, I like to think that Gojo would have changed bits of the story here and there to make himself seem cooler. Anyways, I just don't have a whole lot to say about this arc. The Cursed Womb arc is where I began to slowly gain my appreciation for the overall curse system. In this arc alone, so many different aspects of it are introduced in a way that doesn't feel dense or overbearing. In it, we are introduced to cursed spirit tiers, veils, windows, incomplete domains, domain expansions, and some characteristics of special grade curses such as their innate regeneration. It's also the first good look at a special grade curse the anime has given us in the form of the Finger Bearer. Furthermore, I enjoy that Yuji loses his fight to the bear as miserably as he does, because it gives him a humbling reality check as he hits rock bottom, which proves to be just enough negative emotions for him to unleash his first little bit of cursed energy when he tries to swing back. The sort of symbiotic relationship that Sukuna and Yuji have going on here is also pretty good, where Yuji is willing to bring out Sukuna as needed, but Sukuna is also reluctantly willing to give the body back to Yuji after the fight. Sukuna tearing out Yuji's heart to hold the body hostage is a great way to show off that Sukuna has a better grasp on both of their limits and that he's willing to leverage this fact to his advantage. And even though they obviously weren't going to actually kill Yuji, given that there's still 19 episodes or something like that left, I enjoyed that they were willing to go to that extreme, and this was used to separate him from the main cast for the next 2 arcs rather than some arbitrary reason that pulled him away. The little tidbit of Megami's backstory is okay, but I didn't find it to be all that interesting until it got expanded upon a bit more in the final arc. Despite how short this arc is, I still enjoyed it quite a bit. As I said, I think killing off Yuji to get him off the radar in order to begin his training in Jujutsu sorcery is a pretty creative way of going about a training arc. The highlight of the cursed training arc is obviously Gojo, since his motivation for teaching was unveiled and he had the visually impressive fight against Jogo in episode 7, specifically when they activate their respective domains. Despite how unorthodox Gojo's teaching methods may be, I think it fits his unpredictability and it weirdly makes sense too. I consider episode 8 to be the first filler episode of the anime. It's not a bad episode by any means, I actually quite like the contents of it. Todo's interactions and fight against Megami are both good, and I think his love for Takada-chan is hilarious. Gojo's blunt and disrespectful tone towards Kakuganji comes as a stark contrast to his previously lighthearted behavior, which I also enjoyed since it also ties back with his motivation for teaching. My only issue with this episode is that a lot of the characters we see in this episode won't become relevant until episode 14 onwards. I think the placement of this episode could have been a bit better by throwing it in right before episode 14 and pulling episodes 9 through 13 up by 1 episode count so that they would become 8 through 12. It's not that big of a deal, but it's just something that bothers me a tiny bit. Originally, I had a line in here talking about how this was a very cleverly designed training arc that didn't feel like one, but then I looked up the names of the arcs and here we are now. Versus Mahito is my favorite arc of the anime for a handful of reasons. The atmosphere of the arc is quite grim. The closest comparison in that sense we have right now would be the Cursed Womb arc. I think the atmosphere there worked wonderfully well, and it's even more the case here. It's a combination of a lot of factors that lead to this arc being so gloomy. Yoshino's backstory is full of bullying, Mahito's aforementioned technique is incredibly grotesque, and Nanami is a very serious character that lacks all of the playfulness Gojo carries. As a matter of fact, Gojo is a very absent character for most of this arc, which I think is the greatest contributor to that dark atmosphere. Even the visuals embody those dark tones, with episodes taking places in the rain, the sewers, and under a veil, with occasional moments of brightness with Yuji and Ichichi tracking Yoshino. Both Yoshino and Mahito are good characters, especially Mahito given how his childish excitement for fights is coupled with his abhorrent technique. Yoshino's curiosity eventually leading to his bond with Mahito is a cool pairing that leads to some interesting conversations, especially when Mahito comes to comfort Yoshino after the murder of his mother, before Yoshino turns to, for a lack of better words, the dark side. That's my only real problem with this arc. I think Yoshino finally snapping is done a little too quickly. That's not to say that the death of his mother isn't a valid reason, because it absolutely is more than valid. Him going from having a nice wholesome dinner with Yuji and his mother to then going on a quest for revenge after his mother's murder feels like it's lacking just a tiny bit to bridge it all together. I think what would have solidified it for me was if we saw Yoshino attempting to save his mother from the cursed spirit, an extended conversation between Yoshino and Mahito after the incident, or both. Swinging things back to the positive, this arc also contains some of my favorite fights of the anime, but I'm very willing to admit my bias here and say that this is probably all thanks to Nanami, who is my favorite character. I really enjoyed his back and forth with Yuji while they were fighting off 2 of the cursed creatures on the roof of the theater, his careful analysis of Yuji following a single divergent fist, and the reveal that the creatures they had been fighting the entire time were actually transfigured humans. Nanami's first encounter with Mahito in the sewers stands as one of my favorite moments of the entire anime, although it isn't quite exactly my most favorite. Once again, Nanami's back and forth with Mahito is enjoyable, and while the fight itself isn't all that flashy, it's helped by how fast the fight feels with Nanami's quick movements and Mahito's constantly transforming projectiles, as well as the contrast between Nanami's simple and clean technique compared to Mahito's twisted one. It's all topped off by the rather professional tone Nanami speaks with as he collapses a chunk of the wall on top of Mahito. While I personally wish that this fight was longer or even took up an entire episode, I realized that it was designed to allow Mahito to realize his potential for the final fight of the arc at the high school. I think the first half before Nanami's arrival is decent, with the standout moment being Mahito suddenly transfiguring Yoshino and Sukuna's blatant refusal to tag out with Yuji. The combination of Nanami and Yuji pummeling Mahito while Mahito is transfiguring his body in all kinds of ways is great stuff, and it all peaks when Mahito activates his domain, the self-embodiment of perfection, which stands as my absolute favorite moment in all of Jujutsu Kaisen, and we'll get to that once we get to talking a bit more about Nanami. None of these fights are the best in the anime in terms of complexity or visuals. Going by those standards, I would say the Hanami fight in the following arc takes the cake for both complexity and visuals. But each of the fights in the versus Mahito arc chain off of one another so well, with each one providing more details and context to make the following fight more interesting as Mahito drastically powers up with each encounter. Each subsequent fight is a development on the previous, and it's more like a single drawn-out fight rather than a series of unique ones, which also fits the name of the arc. I think all three of these fights are very good because they fit into a single arc and come one after another, and that they wouldn't carry the same impact for me if they didn't. The bittersweet ending of the arc wraps it up in the perfect way for me. Even though in the morgue Nanami thanks Yuji for saving his life and begins to view him as a proper Jujutsu sorcerer, Yuji is still distraught over having to kill a person for the first time after the anime having made it a point to assert that Yuji swore to never kill a person. Both the bully and the teacher who ignored Yoshino realize their responsibilities and what happened to him and await their respective punishments, whatever that may be. Yuji reinforces his resolve at the end of the episode, but it all came at the cost of a tragedy. I think this arc does the best job in depicting how grim and dangerous the world of Jujutsu Kaisen can be. It doesn't have the best fights or the best visuals, but what it does have comes together so coherently and wonderfully in a way that puts it above all of the other arcs for me. Obviously, the highlight of the Kyoto Goodwill event arc comes in the form of its many fights. Typically, I'm not a huge fan of fights being chained one after another with little to no downtime between them, but I think it works more than fine here because each of the fights have more going on outside of just the action. There are so many characters present at once compared to the rather small central cast of the versus Mahito arc, and I'm happy to report that I think every single character is represented well, and no one feels like they've been shafted in terms of screen time. I won't talk about every single fight, but will just run through a handful of the ones I found the most interesting. Yuji and Todo's fight visually stands out compared to the other fights because it's the first true hand-to-hand combat we've seen of the anime that doesn't incorporate any flashy cursed techniques or tools. Todo authoring his own little bromance fanfiction inside his head is also hilarious, even though his super macho I love big ass personality got to be a little much for me after a while. Panda and Ultimate Mekamaru's fight is unique because these two stand out like a pair of sore thumbs amongst everyone else, both visually and character-wise. Mekamaru firing off his ultimate cannon is one of the coolest looking shots in the anime, and Gorilla Panda being revealed out of the smoke is an amazing follow-up to that as well. Both of them have good backstories, and I think Mekamaru's outlook on cursed corpses is particularly interesting. He was born without a right arm and anything below his knees, with skin so fragile even moonlight burns it, all in exchange for being able to produce great amounts of cursed energy and use it over a long distance, hence why he pilots Mekamaru. He would trade all his powers for a normal body if he could, and watching a cursed corpse like Panda roaming around in daylight understandably greatly upsets him. While this isn't my favorite backstory or motivation in Jujutsu Kaisen, it's one that stands out to me by providing a human look into these two non-human characters. Aside from the incredibly presented Hanami fight, the one fight that stands out to me the most in this arc is the fight between the Zenin sisters, Maki and Mai. Mai shows a surprisingly vulnerable side compared to what we've seen of her previously, where she was frankly just kind of a bitch, to be honest. The backstory is very touching, and I really like that it was told from Mai's perspective rather than Maki's. If it was told from Maki's, then Mai would just seem like a terrible character with no motivation or direction in her life. But since it wasn't told this way, we get to see that she had to enter Jujutsu sorcery so she wouldn't be left behind by her sister's aspirations, and that her hate towards Maki stems from what seems like that sense of abandonment. It also shows Mai's almost immediate recognition of Maki's superior ability, and that even Mai's ace up her sleeve in the form of her construction technique isn't enough. I also found the shot of Maki and Mai running while holding their hands to be quite a powerful one emotionally. It's not a backstory I would have expected out of these two because they've been defined by their intense rivalry so far, and it's made further better by the fact that each sister seems to have a different perspective on their backstories. Mekamaru had something similar but to a slightly lesser degree in the shot where he envisions stepping out of his tub and walking towards his schoolmates. As a last note for the Zenin sisters, I think it's hilarious that Biwa ends up underestimating Maki and paying for it because Mai told her that Maki sucks, which she would say because of their rivalry. All of these fights were the highlight, but the one between Yuji and Todo against Hanami stands as the crown atop its peak. To say that the sequence of Hanami manifesting the roots while Yuji and Todo are running and battling along it is absolutely beautiful would be an understatement to say the least. The close combat is fast, and although I've already spoken at length about it, Boogie Woogie is such a simple way to add a fresh new twist to the fight that keeps on adding to itself. I also love the way that it's introduced with the screen flashing to white at the sound of a clap, ending with the reveal of Hanami being impaled by his own spikes. Todo thinking at the speed of light with his enormous 530,000 IQ brain, which is canon according to Todo, is also my favorite bit out of him across all of the episodes, and it really makes you wonder what it's like to be stuck in the Todo-verse. Even the way the fight ends with Gojo's hollow purple technique cutting a ravine through the entire forest just tops it all off with the same incredible visuals the fight has carried with it. And even though the series of fights in the versus Mahito arc still sticks out to me as my favorite fights of Jujutsu Kaisen for reasons we went over, Hanami versus Yuji and Todo is easily a cut above the rest in terms of just action and visuals alone. Looking outside of fights, Gakuganji ended up being a character I was pleasantly surprised with for a few reasons. I think the anger you can see and hear from him after Gojo unboxes Yuji in front of everyone is great. Him also ordering his students to kill Yuji instead of prioritizing the game is another good extension of this. Miwa feeling hesitant about it helps make the dynamic of the Kyoto students have some more substance, and I wish there was a little more debate within them about whether or not they should kill Yuji, even though I understand why there isn't much of that. Panda explains it later, but most of the Kyoto students don't see Yuji as anything beyond a vessel of Sukuna, so killing him isn't much different from exercising a curse. Besides that, I also really like that Todo doesn't give a fuck about it because he needs to go see Takada-chan once again. Going back to Gakuganji for one last thing, I never anticipated his technique of choice to be the guitar from the opening. I always thought he would never be more than just a boring old fart, and he still is that, but he's an interestingly boring old fart. The arc ends with the second of 2 filler episodes of the anime, and it's pretty good. It's very different compared to everything else because the featured fight is a game of baseball with ultimate pitcher Maru of all things, but it works just fine in acting as sort of an interlude between the end of the Kyoto Goodwill Event arc and the Death Painting arc. I think it's hilarious that everyone throws a mini celebration when Todo pretty much gets shot in the face by Maki as Yuji realizes just how much everyone else hates Todo. The little flavor text that popped up underneath everyone during the game was also great, with my favorite once again being Todo's continuation of his own bromance canon with Yuji. The only thing I can really say about it is that Megumi was really lucky that he had a different taste in women than Todo. Going into the Death Painting arc, I was really unsure as to whether or not this would actually be the best way to end a season. The premise seemed really modest and there wasn't going to be a whole lot of episodes to really do much with it. Furthermore, the final fight would end up being against Eso and Kechizu, 2 characters that are just freshly being introduced to us with this arc. Now, with all that being said, I ended up really liking it. I don't mind that the cast of characters was stripped back down to the original trio of Yuji, Megumi, and Nobara. Ever since the Cursed Womb arc, these 3 really haven't done a whole lot together, and the anime wanted to end things the way it started, if you will. Megumi's backstory gets a lot more developed, and even though I still liked Nobara and the Zenin sisters' backstories more, I appreciate that Megumi's was returned to and brought up to the level of details as those ones. Both fights in the Death Painting arc are great. Megumi against the Finger Bear is made better by the fact that in Megumi's first encounter against the Finger Bear in the detention center, he ran away for safety's sake, but now he's chosen to fight it directly. The contrast of Megumi's typically stoic and composed state versus now his maniacal laughter as he unleashes his domain, the Chimera Shadow Garden, also works wonders for this purpose. Nothing the Finger Bear does is new or spectacular, but this fight's more about the extent of Megumi's capabilities, and it's great in that sense. Even Sukuna approves. The fight between Yuji and Nobara against Eso and Kechizu is great mostly thanks to Nobara. Nobara's masochistic twist onto her straw doll technique is incredible, and outside of the versus Mahito arc and maybe the Hanami fight, it helps distinguish this fight as one of the most memorable parts of Jujutsu Kaisen for me. Her hairpin technique to completely finish off Kechizu gets close to that as well. Eso's inner conflict about either having to save his brother or having to defeat Yuji and Nobara makes those 2 also more interesting characters, which helps a lot because when they were introduced at the end of 23, they gave me some serious vibes of being joke villains. Even though I felt very iffy going into this fight, I ended up coming out more than pleasantly surprised, and it's definitely part of the reason why Jujutsu Kaisen left a good impression on me. Across these arcs, one very minor problem I have with Jujutsu Kaisen is that I think the anime sometimes does things a little too much every now and then. The main examples I would point to would be Todo's inner bromance during his initial encounter with Yuji and Nobara periodically breaking out into gags for the sake of being funny. The first is mostly just that Todo's personality can be a little too much to take in, and just layering it on top of itself doesn't really fix that either. The second is mostly okay, but it just feels inappropriate sometimes, like them doing it twice back to back while inside the domain within the detention center. A third example I'm less sure about would be the 2 sequences showing Yoshino being bullied. I think showing off just one would have been more than fine, and that time used for the second could have been reallocated to better detailing Yoshino's descent into darkness after his mother's murder, although this would of course require some parts of a few episodes to be shifted around here and there. Let's move on to the final section of this video, which will be about just a couple of characters that I had a few extra things to say for. If I had to get really picky about the worst part of the anime, I'd probably say it's that I don't find Yuji to be all that interesting. He's not a bad character and is more than serviceable for the purposes of Jujutsu Kaisen, but he doesn't stand out to me in a real way. I don't find his motivations all that interesting, but I think that has more to do with the fact that the last anime I watched was The God of High School, which also featured a protagonist with only a grandfather they really care for and no visible parents either, so doubling down on that for me really didn't help too much. I think Yuji was most interesting to me during the few occasions where he's directly conversing with Sukuna, whether that's within Sukuna's domain or trying to call for his help in healing Yoshino. Nobara, and to a slightly lesser degree, Megami weren't all that interesting to me either until the very final arc outside of their respective backstories. Even with that said, none of this ever bothered me while watching Jujutsu Kaisen. The introduction arc has Gojo, Cursed Womb had Sukuna, versus Mahito had Mahito and Nanami, the Kyoto Goodwill event had a truckload of side characters, and Death Painting had better versions of Megami and Nobara. So even if I didn't find Yuji to be all that much, there were always other characters I liked around him that my attention was always drawn to. Satoru Gojo is by far the strongest sorcerer in the anime, and it's helped by the fact that everyone also recognizes this fact. Geto outlines it to Jogo, Hanami gets ready to flee once Gojo breaks the veil, and even Stone Cold Nanami Kento acknowledges Gojo's powers. And the display of power he puts on throughout the anime absolutely lives up to that title. The best part of his character is that despite the sheer magnitude of his powers, it's greatly offset by how he carries himself. He's an extremely light-hearted character who rarely gets serious. His level of energy synergizes almost perfectly with that of Yuji, and he's always keeping up that positivity even in the heat of battle, mostly because nothing else can really threaten him. The most serious he's gotten within this season is when he's sitting down and talking to Gakuganji. He typically has a good sense of humor about himself as well, even though sometimes that sense of humor dips down into very childish territories. That contrast makes him one of my favorite characters of the series, but he pales in comparison to the legendary ultra mega fantastic brilliant ex-salaryman Jujutsu sorcerer Nanami Kento. I love this character. I think his depressingly pragmatic outlook on life puts him in a weirdly refreshing position in the anime compared to a lot of the other energetic and bombastic characters. He's far too honest and has no issue with sharing how sad being an adult is, but he's willing to show discretion when it comes to Yuji because he views Yuji as a child. He withholds information such as the location of Mahito's hideout or the fact that one of Sukuna's fingers was involved in the death of Yoshino's mother. Nanami's clear-cut definition of what makes someone an adult or a child is the crux of his relationship with Yuji. It's not about the life or death situations, but rather the little bits of sadness that accumulate and weigh someone down, like seeing your hair fall out on your pillow, or your favorite sandwich being discontinued, the second one hitting a little too close to home for me. Yes, the perspective is described comedically, but it still carries that sentiment. This perspective changes over time as by the end of the versus Mahito arc, Nanami is willing to give Yuji the recognition he deserves after the tragedy that has taken place. My favorite line spoken by Nanami comes in episode 14. Itadori needs that kind of idiocy right now. He says it in response to Gojo coming up with dumb games to pass the time before the Goodwill event begins, and I think it wonderfully encompasses a lot of Nanami's perspectives on the current situation. He was the one with Yuji in the morgue where Yuji was distraught, and Nanami gave his best effort to comfort him while also keeping things realistic and grounded. And even though he's not a huge fan of the stupid ideas Gojo is spouting at the time, he realizes that it's going to be one of those things to cheer up Yuji. I can't express enough just how much I love this line. It's short and simple, but so perfect for the situation. Earlier, when discussing the versus Mahito arc, I said that the activation of the embodiment of self-perfection was my absolute favorite moment of Jujutsu Kaisen. That itself isn't 100% true, because my absolute favorite moment is actually Nanami's backstory that's told in the flashback while he's inside the domain. Nanami lacked a reason for living or something worth doing, so he endlessly pursued money in order to retire to a country with low living costs to be aimless elsewhere. As a side note, I loved it when Nanami's voice actor got increasingly agitated every time he repeated the word money. Nanami's line of work dealt with rich people stocks, a job where nobody would notice it if he completely disappeared because he's essentially faceless to the people he works for, yet he's paid better than the local baker who many people would notice if she disappeared. Nanami exercises a very minor curse that's been latching onto the baker, and as he walks away, she comes out of the store to say thank you. It's a comparison that I never expected to be drawn, but one that I think speaks volumes about a person's value in life. I think the comparison hit even harder because one of the first things we learned about Nanami several episodes ago was that he quit Jujutsu sorcery and work because they were both shitty, and he decided to settle with Jujutsu because it was the lesser of two shits. Comparing that jokey reasoning to his rather subdued but still heavy backstory is what makes the latter so much better for me. It's about a man who found his reason for living not by his own volition or immense effort, but rather from a simple interaction in his mundane day-to-day life. It's subtle in a way that fits Nanami perfectly and makes the moment of him taking off his glasses and coming to terms with his own imminent death a lot more meaningful. And yeah, that's why it stands as my absolute favorite moment in all of Jujutsu Kaisen. So now that we're nearing the end of the video, I do want to bring up something I mentioned at the very start of this video, the hype surrounding Jujutsu Kaisen. I understand that it's a little weird to discuss given the time of this video in relation to when Jujutsu Kaisen aired, but please do understand that this video has been under production for, admittedly, longer than it should have, but still a decent while. It's something that's been lingering in the back of my head for the entire duration of this project. It's not a vitally important piece of information, but I feel that if I don't bring it up, then this video wouldn't be entirely honest. I think that no matter how good Jujutsu Kaisen was, I was always going to leave a little disappointed. This is by no means the anime's fault. As a matter of fact, it's nobody's fault but my very own. As I was waiting for Jujutsu Kaisen to finish airing its first season, I was very much exposed to the hype surrounding it from friends and acquaintances that had been watching it. And even though I was never aboard the metaphorical hype train myself, I absolutely felt the strong wind and heard the loud noise of it passing by. And once hype reaches this imaginary threshold, I think that it begins to reach expectations that simply can't be met, or at least that's how it is for me. I'm fully aware that this is almost certainly a case of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where I believed so strongly that I was going to be left disappointed by Jujutsu Kaisen that I ended up feeling disappointed. Disappointed isn't really the right word, and something like underwhelming isn't exactly accurate either. Those words are too negative, and I can't really put my finger on what that word might be. It's more a sense of, that's it, after it finished. I think the main culprit has to do with the fact that even though I enjoyed the Death Painting arc, it lacked the same kind of ending that the Versus Mahito or the Kyoto Goodwill event arcs had that gave themselves a meaningful sense of closure. It's something I'm ultimately unsure about because I did enjoy a lot of what Jujutsu Kaisen had to offer, and I can't exactly figure out whether or not my enjoyment of it would have been greater or stayed the same had I never self-prophesized myself into this scenario. That being said, Jujutsu Kaisen is obviously an unfinished product. A prequel movie has been announced for a while, and given the outrageous success of Season 1, a Season 2 is inevitable. Only time will tell as to whether or not these will do anything to change the inkling of doubt that stains what was a pretty positive time with the start of Jujutsu Kaisen. It's a question that I'm looking forward to answering someday. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider liking and maybe even subscribing to the channel if you're interested in any future content that might come out. This video ended up coming out really late. I could drop some excuses to defend myself, but ultimately it's my fault that it got delayed, so yeah, that's all there is to that. The next video will be most likely Higehiro, and then afterwards Dynazenon, SSSS.Dynazenon. There is some chance that another video comes out between these two, but that's really hard for me to say with any amount of certainty until the Higehiro video is done. I know it sounds weird when I say it, but I hope it's understandable when I say that I would like to get the Dynazenon video out sooner rather than later, but I also don't want to rush it. I want to ensure that the video needs to take all the time that it needs to. That is everything I have to say for this video, I think. Yes. Yeah, that's it. So, there will be links on the screen if you're interested in checking out some of my other videos. But outside of that, once again, thank you for watching, especially sticking around to the end to hear that thank you. Much appreciation on that one. That'll be everything from me. I'll be signing off, and yeah, take it easy.